Pavel, I want to put that one over to you. There's a suggestion at this end that there isn't an enormous cause for concern and that the regime is a bit more stable than it may appear from the outside. Saying that, the propaganda machine has not had much time to pave the way for succession, and is there a danger that Kim Jong-un will need to take some kind of provocative steps along the lines of some of the things we've seen from North Korea in the past, weapons tests and so on, to prove that he is a man in control and a man of power?
I don't think he will be use these type of tools for proving he's a man of power. But very important event will be held next year in April when they will be celebrating the centenary anniversary of the founder of the state, his grandfather. And I think that this event could show the balance of powers, and we could just understand more vividly what is the real situation with power.
I'm somewhat surprised by the way that none of you have expressed a great deal of concern over instability and a power struggle at the top. Going back in even very recent history, November 2010, North Korea shelled a South Korean island, killing 2 civilians. Earlier the same year, it was accused of sinking a South Korean naval ship with a torpedo, killing 46 sailors. I think the interesting thing is the way analysts have been divided about how these events came about, particularly the Cheonan incident. Some say it was the work of Kim Jong-il. Some say it was part of an initiation process for the son. Others have even suggested it could have been a general acting on his own initiative. Is there anything from these attacks that can inform us about what happens at the top in Pyongyang, and is any cause for concern? Jim?
We don't really know anything very much about who makes such decisions in North Korea. But I think these 2 incidents, if they're taken out of context and presented merely as North Korean provocations, we then go off on the wrong track. These are not isolated incidents. They're part of the tension that arises because of the existence of the maritime boundary, the so-called Northern Limit Line, which the North Koreans do not accept. They're part of the tension that arises because there are fishing fleets operating in these areas that clash and whose protective vessels clash. These are not something that solely relate to North Korea's wish to provoke the outside world. They come from a context. Given the need to consolidate the change of leadership, North Korea is not going to go out and engage in provocative actions. It's going to want to concentrate on domestic affairs, on making sure that the leadership changes go smoothly and making sure that the centenary of Kim Il-sung's birth is marked properly.
Ramon, I want to follow up on that, move the conversation on a little. The United States has for years been experimenting with various diplomatic methods to coerce North Korea into certain kinds of behaviour and away from nuclear weapons. One of the analysts on the Koreas, Marcus Noland, recently said that the country has proven remarkably insensitive to punishments and rewards. Is there any way that outsiders can influence what happens in Pyongyang?
Well, I think there is a way, and this is actually by having a dialogue with Pyongyang. If we go back to the 1990s and 1993-94 with the first nuclear crisis, we see that North Korea, it has been open to have a dialogue with the US, because I think within the North Korean leadership there is a sense that the country cannot run like this forever. And if they want the country to move on, they do have to have good relations with the US, if possible establish diplomatic relations with the US, obviously with Japan as well, but the US obviously is the big fish for Japan in this case. So in this sense, I think when the Bush administration, for example, engaged in a dialogue with North Korea, we saw that North Korea, for example, stopped testing missiles, didn't conduct a nuclear test. It was actually moving forward in the process of denuclearizing, or at least moving towards not engaging in what some people call provocative behavior. So yes, there is a way of influence in North Korea. The problem is that the way of influence in North Korea is through dialogue.
I agree that there are opportunities. It's important that North Korea is accorded what it regards as international respect, so condolences from other leaders matters to them. And I agree that if you do engage with North Korea, it's tough negotiating with them, but you can get working agreements, you can get things that do stick, and even the Americans know that. In the longer term, the broader term, my own solution has always been to aim at the next generation, in a sense, by providing training and education, by showing them what the world is like outside, by showing them alternatives to their own system. It won't work quickly, and there's no guarantee that it will work at all, but it is a better way of going about things. Training, travel, get them out, get them to see the world, and that could tie in with the government-to-government dialogues, which I agree are important.
Pavel, I want to put a question over to you in Moscow. Russia and China have in the past been criticized for shielding North Korea from sanctions or other types of action through the UN Security Council that are being advanced by the US. In your opinion, are Moscow and Beijing being responsible actors?
I think that this criticism is not true because you may see it's very difficult to press North Korea, and the only way to negotiate and deal with them is to negotiate. Moreover, I think that the nuclear issue should be dealt with as the only problem. The biggest problem is that still there is no peace agreement on Korean Peninsula, and this peace agreement should be signed between the USA and China and North Korea, and of course South Korea. The nuclear and missile problem negotiations should coincide with this peace deal. That is, in my opinion, could be the great decision for the Korean Peninsula.
Ramon, do you want to come back on that?
I do agree that there is a slight misunderstanding about the position of China and Russia. I mean, there has been a big change in the position of these two countries over the past 10 years. So, for example, the reason why we have UN Security Council sanctions on North Korea dating back to 2006 is because Russia and China actually decided that this was actually an unacceptable way of trying to engage or influence the North Korean regime. I mean, without the help of China and Russia, this would have never happened. Not only this, it is true that China and Russia probably understand better the position of North Korea, or try to understand better the position of North Korea, and this is perceived as them siding with North Korea. But at the same time, we see that, for example, when Kim Jong-il went back to the negotiation tables, when his regime went back to the negotiation table, this was under pressure to a large extent from China, for example, that sent envoys to Pyongyang to make sure that North Korea would resume negotiations. So maybe from a Western perspective, China and Russia haven't been honest brokers in this case because they have taken a more balanced view on how to deal with North Korea. But probably from a North Korean perspective, and to be fair, even from a probably South Korean, Japanese or Asian perspective, China and Russia have played a constructive role, especially in the case of China, that has actually tried to bridge the gap between North Korea and the US, which is not something easy because obviously they have very different positions of how relations between them should evolve. But China at least has tried to do this. It is true that it hasn't been as successful as we would have thought maybe in 2005 or 2008, but still China is still trying to bridge the gap between these two countries with the help of Russia.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're discussing North Korea, the death of the leader Kim Jong-il, and what happens next. I'm joined by Ramon Pacheco from King's College London and Jim Hoare from the School of Oriental and African Studies and a former British envoy to Pyongyang, and over the phone from Russia by Pavel Leshakov, who runs the Korea program at Moscow State University. Jim, I want to put this one to you. China has expressed concerns about stability in North Korea. The analysts say that Beijing fears a regime collapse or a humanitarian catastrophe that sends refugees spilling across its southern border. In your opinion, is Beijing or Moscow or Washington ready for this feared implosion of North Korea and this quite frightening scenario of loose nukes, loose nuclear weapons?
I think they're probably more concerned about the latter than they are about the former. I think that there is no real appreciation of the problems that would arise. Certainly in South Korea, there's a sort of optimistic hope that it will all come right and they will come into their, as they see it, inheritance. I think the Chinese concern is it is partly refugees who would be going into an area that's already economically in decline, the Chinese northeast. It would increase the number of Koreans in the country, which is not necessarily easy to manage in a multinational country like China. But I think they're also concerned that instability within North Korea, possible development of factional fighting and all the rest of it, might lead the South Koreans and the United States to actually put into place the plans that they are supposedly working on for moving into North Korea. And for the Chinese, the thought of, if it was just the South Koreans, I don't think the Chinese would have a problem. But if it's the United States moving up closer to Chinese borders, then I think the Chinese really do have a problem.
Pavel, can you give us the view from Moscow?
I do agree with Jim that the best way would be to educate new generation. And actually what I've seen in Pyongyang this year is that they are now all learning English language. Unfortunately, previously they were, unfortunately for Russia, because maybe 10 or 20 years ago they were learning Russian language mostly.
Ramon, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I do agree with Jim and Pavel. I think if regime were to come, which I think is unlikely, but you never know, obviously, with any regime of these characteristics, China is going to have a massive problem. This is going to be related to the refugees, but especially to the fact that maybe the South Koreans obviously would be, to an extent, taking over the peninsula. But if this is with the help with the Americans, obviously the Chinese would have American troops in their border, actually, in the northeast border, plus the other ones that they have in Japan and other places. So for China, this would be a major problem. Also in South Korea, there seems to be a benign neglect of what is going on in North Korea. There is this view that because South Korea is now a developed country, it is becoming an increasing power in East Asian politics or Asian politics. Whatever happens with North Korea won't deeply affect North Korea, at least as the view of the population. Maybe the diplomats obviously might have a different view. And I think this is actually a mistake, because obviously the implosion of a regime of these characteristics with 23 million people living in North Korea would affect the whole regional dynamics, political dynamics, but also economic and security dynamics, obviously. So in this sense, I think there are preparations going on, going back to the original question that you posed to Jim a little bit ago. But on the other hand, there seems to be this idea that things will carry on as usual if North Korea eventually collapses, which I think is probably a mistake.
That was Ramon Pacheco from King's College London. I was also joined by Jim Hoare, a former British envoy to Pyongyang, and over the phone from Russia by Pavel Leshakov, who runs the Korean program at Moscow State University.